Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has apologised to a Libyan dissident after the UK played a part in his detention and torture by Colonel Gaddafi's forces 14 years ago. Theresa May said Abdul Hakim Belhaj and his wife Fatima Bouchar, who was pregnant at the time, had suffered appalling treatment. The couple say an MI6 tip-off helped the US kidnap them in Thailand. They were then taken to Libya, where Mr Belhaj was tortured. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera has been to meet him in Istanbul. There's flash photography at the start of his report.
In Istanbul, a meeting between Britain's ambassador and Abdul Hakim Belhaj, a man who says Britain colluded in his torture. A letter from the Prime Minister and a handshake signals the closing of a dark chapter for the UK government. Just moments before, Mr Belhaj had watched this unprecedented apology in Parliament to him and his wife.
On behalf of Her Majesty's government, I apologise unreservedly. We are profoundly sorry for the ordeal that you both suffered and our role in it. The UK government has learned many lessons from this period.
In an exclusive TV interview, Mr Belhaj told me he was grateful, even though it had taken so long.
It's been 6 years of prison and 6 years of waiting, which was a continuation of the suffering for me and my family, and hopefully today represents the end of all that.
The story begins with another handshake between Tony Blair and Colonel Gaddafi in 2004. The Libyan leader gave up his nuclear weapons programme. Britain promised to help him against his opponents. The same month, Mr Belhaj, who'd fought against Gaddafi, was detained by the CIA in Asia based on a British tip-off. He was flown to Libya. With him was his pregnant wife. He says he was then tortured by Colonel Gaddafi's regime and also interrogated by British officials. After Gaddafi's fall in 2011, letters from MI6 to Libyan officials were discovered detailing Britain's involvement. Belhaj launched a legal action against the British government, Sir Mark Allen, an MI6 officer named in the files, and Jack Straw, who was Foreign Secretary. Today, Jack Straw acknowledged he had given verbal approval for some intelligence to be shared, but says he'd always sought to act lawfully. After years of damaging revelations, the British government has finally decided to apologise in return for the legal case being dropped. Their hope is that this will draw a line under the past, a past in which deals with dubious regimes took Britain and its spies into difficult places. In London, Mr Belhaj's wife and son went to Parliament to hear the Attorney General's apology in person. She received compensation of £500,000. But her husband had not asked for money. All he said he wanted was an apology, and today he got it. Gordon Carrera, BBC News, Istanbul.
So the Prime Minister has apologised unreservedly to the Libyan dissident Abdul Hakim Belhaj and his wife for the UK's involvement in their detention, rendition and torture. Theresa May's letter of apology, read out in Parliament by the Attorney General, said Mr Belhaj and Fatima Bouchar, who was pregnant at the time of their detention in 2004, had suffered appalling treatment. Our political correspondent Michael Crick has this report.
Fatima Bouchar came to Parliament to hear an extraordinary apology. Here with the 13-year-old son with whom she was pregnant at the time that she and her husband were abducted in the Far East in 2004, snatched by the CIA on a tip-off from MI6. Taken to Libya, she was kept in dreadful conditions for 4 months and her husband tortured. The Attorney General read from a letter sent to the couple by Theresa May.
On behalf of Her Majesty's government, I apologise unreservedly. We are profoundly sorry for the ordeal that you both suffered and our role in it.
He gave the sparse House the outline deal.
First, no admissions of liability have been made by any of the defendants in settling these claims. Secondly, The claimants have now withdrawn their claims against all the defendants. Thirdly, the government has agreed to pay Mrs. Butchar £500,000. Mr. Belhaj did not seek and has not been given any compensation.
Belhaj himself was in Turkey today, where the British ambassador gave him Mrs. May's letter, saying sorry to a man kidnapped, tortured, jailed for 6 years, even sentenced to death at one point by the Gaddafi regime. Today's momentous handshake stems from another. The time Tony Blair, then fighting Al-Qaeda, made friends with the Libyan dictator, of whom Abdel Hakim Belhaj was a big critic. Indeed, this famous meeting was just 2 weeks after Belhaj was snatched. Papers found after Gaddafi's fall show the former MI6 official Sir Mark Allen was involved in Belhaj's abduction to Libya. Belhaj and his wife tried to prosecute Allen and Jack Straw, who, as Foreign Secretary, approved what MI6 did. Mr. Straw today said the events described by the couple were deeply distressing for them.
In every case where my approval was sought,
Straw explained,
I assumed, and was entitled to assume, that the actions for which my approval was sought were lawful. This included, in appropriate cases, obtaining assurances as to the humane treatment of those concerned.
Outside Parliament, Fatima Butchar was joined by some of the lawyers who fought her case. Their costs, now to be paid by the government, could run into millions.
What I would say to that is that we offered absolutely at the outset of the case, writing to the government to walk away for a full apology, which we now have, and no money at all. This could have been done immediately for pretty cheap.
In Istanbul this afternoon, Abdel Hakim Belhaj said this was a historic day, which for him crowned many years of suffering.
I hope this step and this positive policy will be considered as a model, and I hope it will be considered a new page opened by the British government and to be a model for several governments that do not take human rights into consideration.
And the CIA's past abduction and interrogation policies are now being questioned by US senators. As yesterday, they considered Gina Haspel, President Trump's nomination for CIA director.
I would not allow CIA to undertake activity that I thought was immoral.
As this story now looks settled in London, the scrutiny continues in Washington.
Well, Michael Crick reporting. I'm joined now in the studio by Corey Kreider, the lawyer who represented the Belhaj family for the human rights charity Reprieve. Have you ever come across quite such a complete apology and indeed a payout, both legal fees and to the wife of a victim?
I've never seen an apology anything like this in a war on terror case. Nothing so wide, so deep, or, if I'm honest, so sincere. I really believe when the Attorney General and Theresa May say that they believe Abdel Hakim and Fatima and their accounts of their story, I think they meant that. I absolutely think they did.
You mentioned the war on terror, and this was the context of it. And perhaps this does reveal that it is very difficult to have a war on a noun. That, in fact, once you depersonalize what the war's about, I mean, if the war's against the Nazis, I mean, clearly people can understand what's going on and have some sort of stance. But a war against a noun surely makes it a very difficult thing to have sort of humanity prevail.
And I think you see exactly what the consequences when you look at a case like this, where UK intelligence is used to help the CIA and the Libyan spies abduct an anti-Gaddafi dissident who was just opposed to Gaddafi's dictatorship and his pregnant wife. The CIA brutalized both of them before they were sent back to Gaddafi's dungeons. So, yes, I do agree.
We saw there in Michael Crick's report the candidate to become the head of the CIA, and she was there in the dark site, as they call it, in Thailand, where awful things happened to Mr. Belhaj and where he started his journey back to Libya. Does she come out of this in a sort of credible way?
We've asked several questions about exactly what Gina Haspel's position was in CIA at the time of their abduction.
She ran the site.
She ran it, I think, in 2002, yes. In 2004, I'm not actually sure exactly where she was, but certainly she had a senior position in the Counterterrorism Center, probably was deeply involved in rendition. And just this week, the contrast couldn't be clearer, right? She's there in the Senate. Senators are supposed to be asking her questions, fully her record about whether she's fit to be director of the CIA. She doesn't answer anything. And the reality is, here this week, in the United Kingdom, finally, at long last, torture gets you an apology. But in the United States, torture seems to get you a promotion.
Now, Mr. Belhaj's wife, who suffered considerably herself, she was pregnant at the time, she was drugged, I believe. Was the baby that she was expecting affected, do we know?
Abderrahim, who was with her today, that was her son who she was carrying in the parliament today, he was about 4 pounds when he was born.
4 pounds?
He weighed 4 pounds.
So he was certainly underweight.
Yes.
And so she gets the £500,000 and he gets nothing. But
that's exactly right. And Mr. Belhaj hasn't taken a cent still. Mrs. Belhaj has accepted £500,000. I would say that the 6.5 years of this litigation have basically forced her to relive the worst moments of her life again and again. And I would also say that they both sincerely offered to withdraw the litigation at basically the very, very beginning for no money if the United Kingdom would simply have apologized to them. So it could have been done for considerably less, I'm afraid.
I mean, clearly they have suffered emotionally dreadfully, as you have suggested, but I mean, is their future assured? Do they have a safe place to live?
I think at the moment, things are looking up for them. Today has been an unbelievably positive day for them, actually. I think the sincere spirit in which the Attorney General and the Prime Minister dealt with them and the apology that they were given today has been very gratifying to them. Of course, Libya doesn't look like any of us would have hoped that it would look, but Mr. Belhaj has been fighting to get rid of dictatorship for a long time, and sometimes it takes a long time to get to democracy. I think they feel more hopeful today than they have in a very long time.
Are there more Belhajes in the pipeline, or is he a one-off?
I hope that there are not more Belhajes in the pipeline.
I mean, Reprieve isn't handling any other.
No, there are some other Libyan cases, a case called Kamoka and others that involve other intelligence sharing and people who were detained, but I'm not aware of something quite as severe as a man and his pregnant wife being abused by the CIA and then sent back to Gaddafi.
Corey Crider, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
The government made quite an apology today. I don't think anyone could say it was half-hearted or worded ambiguously. It was an apology to Abdel Hakim Belhaj and his wife Fatima Bouchar, who, with the help of MI6, were abducted and tortured in Libya in 2004. The apology was read by the Attorney General Jeremy Wright in the name of the Prime Minister.
The UK government's actions contributed to your detention, rendition and suffering. The UK government shared information about you with its international partners. We should have done more to reduce the risk that you would be mistreated. We accept this was a failing on our part. On behalf of Her Majesty's government, I apologise unreservedly. We are profoundly sorry for the ordeal that you both suffered and our role in it.
Well, there was £500,000 of compensation too, and a ceremonial handing over of the apology letter to Mr. Belhaj as well, just in case anyone had missed how abject this sorry was. But it did settle the matter for the couple, who then dropped legal action against the government, as well as Jack Straw, who was Foreign Secretary, and Sir Mark Allen, former head of counter-terrorism at MI6. Now, while it was Theresa May who said sorry for the government, it was, of course, Tony Blair who was PM at the time of the abduction. We know governments make mistakes. We've had more than one apology for the Windrush scandal, for example. But is this an admission of an error, of such an error, that it sits as a serious blot on the Labour government of the time? Our political editor, Nick Watt, is with me. I mean, Nick, take us through the curious timing of all of this.
Well, all this is in the context of the post-9/11 world, where there's a common interest in tackling al-Qaeda. Now, there are three key dates. In December 2003, Tony Blair announces that Colonel Gaddafi has agreed to dismantle his programme of weapons of mass destruction. And the significance of that was obviously the failure to find WMD in Iraq. Now, just 3 months after that historic deal where Tony Blair lavished praise on Colonel Gaddafi, MI6 provides crucial intelligence that leads to the detention of a leading Libyan dissident, Abdel Hakim Belhaj, and his wife. They are detained in Bangkok and they are flown in short order to Tripoli. It is important to say that Mr. Belhaj denies ever being a supporter of al-Qaeda. And then just 2 weeks after he is detained, Tony Blair turns up in Tripoli, meets Colonel Gaddafi in his tent. I was on that trip, and I remember that British officials accompanying the Prime Minister talked about great intelligence sharing cooperation with the Libyans. It's important to say that Jack Straw, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time of this, he's released a statement today, and he says, in every case where my approval was sought, I assumed and was entitled to assume that the actions for which my approval was sought were lawful. This included, in appropriate cases, obtaining assurances as to the humane treatment of those concerned. And Sir Mark Allen, who was the MI6 officer who was dealing with the Libyans, he's never spoken publicly about this, but along with Jack Straw and all the agencies involved, he denies individual wrongdoing.
But the timing, all very compressed there between the rapprochement with Gaddafi and the meeting in the tent. Well, I'm joined by Lance Price, who was former Labour Director of Communications. He left the Blair government 3 years before Abdel Hakim Belhaj was seized. Very good evening to you. Did you wonder today why Theresa May was having to apologise for this rather than the people who were kind of in power at the time it all happened, Blair, Straw or the others?
No, I think people would have found it strange that she was apologising on behalf of the British government when it was actually a different government, of course, that was responsible and was in power at the time. And it was a pretty damning indictment on that government, the most damning I think I've heard from one government on a previous one.
Yeah. We expect politicians, don't we, to take responsibility. You know, Amber Rudd has to take responsibility for cock-ups at the Home Office, even though she didn't deport people and she didn't personally deprive them of healthcare. Do you think the environment created by the government, the politicians, at that time, in this desperate attempt to have a rapprochement with Gaddafi, do you think that was responsible for this?
I think that is largely what led to it, yes. I mean, there's no doubt at all that Tony Blair was determined by one means or another to reduce the threat, eliminate the threat if he could, from what were considered to be rogue states who were armed with weapons of mass destruction. Now, in the case of Iraq, we know that they didn't exist. In the case of Libya, they certainly did, and he thought that this deal was going to disarm Gaddafi's Libya, and he thought clearly that it was worth making some concessions, giving Gaddafi something in return for it, and we know what the price of that was now.
Yeah. And in general, do you think he was someone who would think there's a bigger end here, and, you know, OK, someone's getting renditioned, and that's just the price you pay for these things?
I think people will still ask that horny old question, who knew what, when, and whether or not Mr Blair and Mr Straw knew at the time that it was all but certain that he was going to be tortured. They would say not, I presume, but I think if somebody had gone up to Tony Blair at the time and said, you do realise that this guy is likely to end up in a Libyan prison and be tortured, that he would have considered that an acceptable price to pay.
You would have thought he would consider that unacceptable or unacceptable?
I think it's very hard to conceive that that thought hadn't occurred to him.
Really? So you think, I just wanted to be clear, you said he would have thought that was unacceptable, not unacceptable.
That is what I said.
Right,
that is exactly what I said.
Right, I wanted to get that right. Well, isn't all of this going to show the Middle East? I mean, we've got Iraq already, but this and the kind of the crawling up to Gaddafi, is this going to be a really, on top of Iraq, a big blot, the way this was executed?
Yes, I'm sure a lot of people will put it together alongside Iraq. I mean, on the scale of Iraq, of course, it's a very different thing. As an indelible stain on the moral integrity of that government, undoubtedly.
I wonder whether, you know, governments make mistakes. They might build a power station that shouldn't have been built, or a railway line, or had the wrong immigration policy. When somebody is tortured, do we think that is the kind of mistake that a government makes that is somehow in a different league or a different category?
Well, it's obviously something which I think people find completely morally unacceptable. There's a moral quality to it, which as there would be over immigration policy too, but perhaps not over the building of a railway line. But it's something that I think goes to the heart of what government is all about. But let's be clear, it wasn't the British government who was torturing But I think, and the denials that were made by the government at the time, a clever lawyer, a clever politician, and sometimes they're the same thing, could just about stand over. But there's no doubt that the government did facilitate rendition and did at the very least turn a blind eye to torture, and that's a pretty serious charge.
But is that not also against the law? I mean, so we don't know who did know what when, and we don't know. Jack Straw says he might have signed it off, but he would not have signed it off knowing what the consequence was. But if you think Tony Blair might have said, look, that would be a price to pay. He didn't say it, and he didn't have to say it. But if he had thought that, that would be, I mean, that would be, you know, kind of illegal. We don't think about politicians as going that far. That would be against the Human Rights Act.
It would absolutely be against the Human Rights Act if he had condoned or encouraged or was actually responsible for torture happening, and I don't think that that is what people are
shipping people into a country where torture is going to happen.
He didn't ship anybody either, but the British government did provide the intelligence that enabled others to do that. And it's significant that in the Prime Minister's statement today, she says that the government, she means the Blair government, should have realised earlier what our partners were up to.
Lance,
not what we were doing.
Lance, thank you very much indeed. Thanks.